Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick. With me is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, let's dive in. We're on Genesis 3:8. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. This is it. This is an interesting verse. There's a lot here. First of all, I want to say that I think what makes this verse so important is that it reveals something about what has been lost in humanity's relationship with God. We don't get, here's what, God's interaction was with the man and the woman when they were in the garden before this moment of sin, right? But this verse hints at what that might have been like. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting. And so I think what we're getting here is a hint of the closeness with God that sin prevents us from having. It creates a chasm, a disconnectedness. And here we get a hint of that. So there is a lot packed into this verse, but I think to really grasp it, just as with the previous verse, we need to explore the meaning of a couple of different terms, right? And the first term, it relates to this idea of God walking in the garden. What's interesting is the term here in this phrase, the term used for sound, they heard the sound of God walking in the garden. That word actually means voice. That's weird because, the voice of God walking in the garden.
They heard the
odd.
Voice?
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
It would be they heard the voice of God walking in the garden.
Interesting.
That seems weird, right? But we've translated it to sound instead. But what I think is that maybe that was a bit of a mistake. Maybe actually there is something to voice, right? I think the issue is we've been very gripped by, again, taking the story historically,
yeah.
And gripped to this idea of God physically walking with man, with who will eventually be called Adam here in the garden. And so they've changed this word to conform with that idea. They've changed it to sound. Because I think it's the King James even that still says voice, but I'd have to look that up again.
Really?
Yeah, I think there's a couple early translations that do say that. But again, with our desire to look at it historically, that word doesn't make as much sense. And
even physical representation, not physical, but artistic representations of this. In artistic representations, how do you represent the voice of God? I mean, there's ways of potentially doing that, but it doesn't make for the same concept.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't make for the same visual as compelling visually.
Yeah. So what we should do is look at the word walk for a second and think of that then. I think maybe it's the word walking that we've kind of failed to really understand. Perhaps it's not meant to be interpreted so much as a literal walk, considering that this same word is used in the coming chapters for both Enoch and Noah. They are described as walking with God. And I mean, as far as I know, I don't know anyone that takes that to be a literal walk, a literal physical, manifestation of that. Instead, that is widely understood to be metaphorical about the kinds of lives they lived, right? Was one that was walking with God. And so those are spiritual walks. So then if we look at the word here, right, that's translated walk, it's also used to mean go, went, flow, floated, and steadily. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that those words are better translation, but I do think perhaps it can give us an understanding of like what kind of walking we are talking about here, right? And perhaps it's not to be so much of a physical idea, especially when we consider this idea of floating or floated, right? If they heard the voice of God floating through the garden, there's sort of something to that phrase as well, Again,
that feels very different.
Yeah, it doesn't make for the same kind of painting, right?
No, it doesn't. No.
But I don't know. That's there may be something to that idea as well, being captured in here.
There's, I mean, this has implications. I don't. This has implications just in the way in which you emphasize certain things, I think, as you go through the entire story of the Bible, because going backwards of what we've already hashed out, it's important to look at and realize that, like, the voice, the significance of word that we talked about, how God speaks reality into existence, and the voice of God is the thing that is compelling creation forward.
Right.
That's the main image we get of God as
Right.
it moves forward and moves forward in the and then God breathes life into man. It's this, that's what God's perceived as, and this would be actually the first instance that we would see God as taking some sort of corporeal form and then navigating in it.
Right.
And if this isn't the case, if that's different than that, then I think that also going forward changes the perspective. Now, obviously, there's stories like the three men who come to Abraham before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then there's the burning bush. So we see, like, potential
even
physical.
Abram, when he first gets to Canaan,
Yes,
when he first gets to Canaan, it says the Lord appeared to him there.
Yeah. So we see potential relative physical manifestations, but in terms of really coming as a human, that makes Jesus be this, feel distinct from this earlier image of how God interacted with humanity.
Maybe, yeah.
You know, and that's maybe, and that's because you imagine hear him as being a taking on a human form and walking around with Adam and Eve. But if it's more so they're having a different type of interaction with him, that feels like it sets Jesus more as a distinct manifestation of God.
Yeah, it does. Well, and even in Jesus, there's strange things there, right? Given that after he's resurrected, there are people who see him who knew him, who don't recognize him.
Mm-hmm.
And after spending some time with him, suddenly realize, oh, that's him, you know? So there's a lot there, you know, to get into in terms of physical manifestation and appearances. But I guess my point here is mostly to show that there's the idea of God, you know, crunching, you know, sticks between his or under his feet as he's walking through the garden might not exactly have been the sound that, you know, we're talking about here, you know, because if we return to the word being translated as sound, other than in this verse and in verse 10, it's not translated again as being sound. The word is typically used as voice throughout all of Genesis 1 through 11 here. It's never shows up as sound again.
Well, and I'm gonna go to verse 10 because it's, and we don't need to get too far into it, but I heard the sound of you in the garden. This is Adam, I think Adam responding.
Yeah.
And he says, I heard the sound of you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Right. This is after God asks where you
voice.
Exactly. Well, and then look at how humans respond to spiritual interactions. I mean, that's throughout the rest of the Bible. It's fear.
Yeah.
It's fear. Right. It's God appears and it's fear. And so I mean, that's powerful. That's powerful because it's like if you hear the voice of God and you're afraid, that's different than just hearing the sound of his steps coming. Because the voice is the thing that's the power. The voice is the thing that caused creation. The voice is the thing that causes things to come to be. And if you're afraid by that,
it's important.
Yeah. That's, I don't even know if I can comprehend right now the significance of that. But that feels more significant. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, so notably, this word again, it's used when God asks Cain about Abel and says that the voice of his brother's blood is crying out to him. It wasn't the sound of his brother's blood. It was the voice of his brother's blood is crying out to him. So but I guess my point here is I do see this as having this sort of distinctly spiritual meaning to it. And we see that coming up a lot. So if we bring these ideas together and look at the idea of that word that was walking, go, went, float, floated, I think what we see here is more the idea of the man and the woman hearing the voice of God passing through the garden, if that makes sense. It's within the garden, right? And that, I think what we see here is the opportunity to have that kind of connection, that kind of moment with God is lost as a result of sin. Because this is something that is described as occurring within the garden. They are connecting, as you were pointing out, again, going back to the context of Genesis 1, God creates with his word, right? And so here we have man and woman in that garden able to listen to that voice, right? That created. And that actually makes sense in the context that we talked about previously of the garden and being gardeners and bringing the world into submission, right? With God's order. We've talked about this a lot. A connection with that same voice makes sense if you look at it that way, right? And so we might in sort of like spiritually symbolic terms see that sin disconnects us from that voice that speaks the fullness of God's design for creation. Right? It prevents us from really seeing his full order, which I think makes some sense because we get ideas about how God has ordered things and wants things to work within the Bible, but we don't see the whole thing, nor do we have access to that voice in the same way anymore. And that is a result of sin. So it's almost like as a result of sin, you're no longer able to be a gardener. Interesting. I wonder what's going to happen here soon in the story. It sort of makes sense if you're cut off from that voice. Well, I guess you're not fit to really tend the garden anymore. Now we're having to start from scratch, I guess, is what we see. So, so I guess that's the point being there's a sort of intimacy that is sort of implied, I guess, in this verse as existing, prior to the sin. If that makes sense. Now that is lost as a result of this. So, and it's a weird path to go down, but it's interesting to think about that in terms of little kids, right? Who haven't yet really recognized sin in the same way as us, haven't reached that point of maturity where they've eaten of the fruit or whatnot. Having kids, and raising kids, you experience them in that age. I think there is something to the idea that maybe they have actually a closer spiritual connection with God than those of us adults. It's interesting when you discuss spiritual matters with kids of that age. There's surprising amounts of wisdom that they come up with, where it's like, where did that come from? How do you know that? And a part of you thinks maybe they actually do. Maybe they're able to hear things that we can't, right? So yeah, I don't know, just something to think about. I think those in the audience who have had little kids and dealt with that, I'm sure they've had experiences similar to that. But all right, so next we want to look at this idea of the cool of the day. This word is sometimes also described as being breezy or windy. But in all of Genesis, this word is typically used to represent the Spirit of God, the Spirit of life, or the breath of life. In fact, if you go back to when the Spirit of God is hovering over the deep, we see it there, or we see it, this actually, the only other time it's used to represent anything wind-like is it's described as the breeze that God sends to clear back the floodwaters. in a few chapters here, right? Thus bringing life back to the place he had submerged, right? Clearing the waters returns the life to the area. So that I think is interesting. In Exodus, we see the word being used to more regularly relate to wind. But again, even there, it's coming from God. It's a wind sent by God. So my point here is that I think when we read this, it's like, oh, this describes what time of the day God was just hanging out. That tends to be the historical reading, is to say, oh, well, it must have been the evening then, clearly, because it was the cool of the day. So God, in the evening, he decided to come out and check out on how man and woman were doing. And I think that's really not what this word is being used to describe, because it doesn't describe anything like that anywhere else. I think what we're seeing here is that it's another element of how intimate the relationship between God and humanity was meant to be. Because we just talked about the voice, right? And the idea of breath, which, remember, spirit of life, breath of life, it relates to those things a lot, this same word. Those things are closely linked. And of course, it is the breath of God that gives humanity life. And so I think what we're seeing here, again, further describing that closeness that is cut off as a result of sin, as a consequence of sin, is that there's something about that connection between God and man that relates to breath. We know breath, of course, is life-giving, it's restorative, it's all of those kind of things. And that is cut off as well. So the sort of the restorative aspects, the breath-like aspects of being close to God now are cut off as a result of sin, because this was something that happened in the garden and it no longer happens when we're outside of the garden. So that's why I look at this verse and I see it maybe showing, again, tying into the voice and the breath, and you just don't have the intimacy with God that we do in a quote unquote garden state. And that restorativeness.
The thing that connects that I keep thinking about, putting all of these together, the fact that they heard, the fact that it was sound that caused them to perceive it, the fact that it's emphasizing this as potentially being the spirit, the wind, the breath of God coming into the presence of the garden, is that none of those things are seen. Is that those aren't physically like seen with a face exactly,
right? So if you take a very historical approach, then you might be missing all of this.
Yeah, you might be,
and on building it around walking and seeing God and hearing him coming and then seeing him there, and the physical presence. Like, no, I think what we're being described here is, or what's being described is, something much deeper than a physical presence. Again, if you want to say, okay, well, maybe there was also a physical presence tied into it. Okay, fine, maybe so. But the point here is, I think what these verses describe is something much deeper than a physical presence. So whether it is just this depth or in addition to a physical presence, the point is, I think too often we miss that other thing in these verses.
Well, we tend to value above other. We tend to take sight as being the most
basic,
factual. It's connected to the most realistic thing. It's right there in front of you. It's pressing at you. We present people who don't see things. We use it allegorically as people who are blind. They don't see, they don't perceive reality as it properly is. But
there's the most shared experience of that.
Yeah.
Right. Because when I taste something, I taste it, but I don't know that you taste it
exactly the same. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, when we look at a painting, we believe we're looking at the same painting. Now,
exactly.
Really, all of that's a whole different measure. But in terms of how we react to it,
we tend to believe that.
We believe that we're objectively looking at it.
Well, and then that's why wind, I think, is powerful, because I think the image that's being created of God here is that it is perceived with a different sense than is the most that is the most materialistic. It's perceived with the sense of hearing, which is a perception that is a bit more vague. It's a thing that you don't see, but you can tell is there. Like
Right.
wind, if when it's coming through, you can hear wind passing and you can feel wind, but you don't see it. And I know that's cliched, but that's if that's the idea that's potentially being got here, that's powerful. That's an impactful image of what God is. That changes the way we mainstream Protestantism could be accused a lot of times, justifiably so, of being of detracting from the spiritual element of Christianity. They'll say if it's in the Bible, it's in the Bible. That's it. That's all we're looking at. We're not going to have any opportunity for some sort of spiritual perception. And this is saying, well, no, but God is spiritual. Like he's perceived spiritually,
right.
And I know in this show, we're going through and we're analyzing the text very, very deeply. So we're probably leading more into that idea.
Yeah.
But it's perhaps shouting back at you, look, even Adam and Eve perceive God not in a very cut and dry manner. It was perceived in this way in which they heard God and they understood that he was there, but it wasn't like they were able to all go and like, you see God, he's right there,
Yeah.
Which is a different perception of God. So yeah,
for sure. So to wrap up that idea before we get to the next one, because it matters, in other words, I guess what we're seeing here is that to live without God, to live without what is present in this verse, God in the garden, right? To live without that, which is the consequence of sin, is actually a kind of death itself, because it cuts us off from the creative voice and the life-giving breath of God, right? So there's something right there. You could see that as being the idea of a spiritual death. If you have this restorative breath of God, right, that is the source of life, would be cut off from that would be death. But in a strange twist in this verse, right, is that while being cut off from these things is a consequence of sin, we actually see here the man and woman hiding from those things. So the consequences, you're cut off, but before they're even cut off from those things, they're hiding from them. That's interesting, right? Because I think what we see here, again, it's more than a casual stroll with God. But they're hiding. Well, again, we're looking at these terms together as describing some kind of deep intimacy with God. Well, they're hiding from that deep intimacy with God. So the sin, the sensation of having sinned, the recognition of one's inadequacy, made them want to hide from an intimate interaction with God. And I find that interesting, right? Because we so often look at it as though, oh, our sin has cut us off from God, but we're so desperate to get back to him. Except weirdly, what we see here is not that. We see our sin woke us up to who we are, right? In terms of man and woman here, of humanity, and we hid from God. And that's interesting. The consequence of sin is hiding from God. It's also being cut off from God, but the first thing is you hide from God. And I don't know, that's interesting, right? Because this is again, within the story, it is presented in a way where it's like, well, this must have been familiar to the man and woman, right? God coming to them in this context. It's presented that way in the story, right? Otherwise, hearing the voice and all of those things, that means that there was a sense of familiarity because they knew what it was and they knew to hide from it. So they heard the creator and life giver using that voice, as you described, right? That creates with just a word, coming to them and revealing himself to them in a way that is rejuvenating and like breathing in his spirit. Again, if we go to that word, and they hide, that's, I don't know, that's interesting. That's interesting to me, that that sort of that intimate relationship sin scares us from wanting to be around that in a way. So I find that very interesting, and it creates I think it creates a whole nother avenue for rejection of the saving grace that Christ offers. Too often it's like, well, they just don't believe. And if they just believe that Jesus was real and who he says he was, then they would believe, and it's like, or maybe they wouldn't, maybe they would be too scared. Right. And there's, I don't know, there's something in that, I guess.
Yeah. The father analogy that's used over and over again that's used frequently when Jesus uses it from time with like the prodigal son. The idea that comes to my mind is this image of like of being raised by a king, and being the child of a king, and having that sort of intimacy where you're not recognizing that figure as a king, you're recognizing them as a parent, which is a different relationship than a subject to a king. And then taking the step as being that child of a king and inciting a rebellion against them, and then suddenly that relationship has shifted from, rather than father to child, it's been turned over to the king, to rebel,
right? Which David had to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a very good image of it. And so it's like,
even here, though,
that does cause for the hiding.
It's not a rebellion, though, right? It's not quite a rebellion, because it's not like meant to overthrow God or anything like that, right? It was just not following his command, and then being scared to be in the presence of him afterwards, right? And that to me is interesting, because to say, oh, well, they were trying to hide from the consequences of it, right? They didn't want God to punish them, and so therefore they hid. Well, they're not stupid. Let's assume, right? They knew they weren't going to hide from God forever, right? It would be silly of us to presume that they were that foolish, right? To think
the impulse. This is a measure of impulse.
Yeah, well, it's a measure of impulse, but it's also, I think,
or instinct. I guess instinct would be better, because it's the reaction that you have without thinking.
Yeah, well, I'm going to the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son squanders the fortune, and what does he do too, right? He doesn't run back to his father immediately. He also tries to hide away, right? Living with the pigs, and being jealous of their slop. So it is the thing that we do, I guess. The first thing we do when we fail, when we sin, when we screw up, the first thing we do is we try to hide it from God, and not, even though we now recognize it ourselves, we trying to somehow not reveal it to him, which is obviously insane, because we obviously do that. But I don't know, it's just interesting to think that that's what we do. We hide from that initially.
Yeah, it also acts as a judge. That's the thing that feels that I feel too. I get this image of in reading this of especially as we talk about it as an adequacy of of taking like piano lessons as a kid and having a week where you didn't practice at all, and you show up and the instructor's there, and your instructor might be nice. A lot of people have mean piano teachers. I didn't have many mean piano teachers. And so they would be benevolent. They would be kind. They would absolutely. But the feeling of wanting to hide, maybe if I didn't do it at the time, but the feeling of wanting to hide when it's going to be laid bare, the fact that I am inadequate in front of the, let's say, benevolent teacher, even if the teacher's kind, and even if they don't,
I would argue reprimand, they have to be kind.
It's even worse if they're kind.
For it to be real shame. Right? Because otherwise you're hiding from the consequences. I guess that is really, I think, the point here in this verse is this is the kind God. This is the God who gave them life. This is the God who created the world for them, right? This is the kind God. And that's why they're hiding. They're not hiding because they're scared of the consequences. They're hiding because that exacerbates their shame. Right? And that would give them greater pain in relation to their sin. They would give them greater shame. And I guess expanding it out, that is true of all of us, right? We hide it because in the presence of God, our sin takes on even greater shame, because you now have something to really contrast it to, right? And so if you have the benevolent teacher, as you're talking about, who's a good person, who probably wouldn't do what you did, at least in your mind, that's the way you see them, then it becomes even more shameful, because they're not a person who deserved this, right? If the teacher was mean, you could almost, in your head, in a way, say, well, I'm hiding from the consequences, but frankly, they deserve me not doing this because they're not nice and all of that, right? But if the God is kind and is, the God we see here, who is again, gave them life, and I think that's part of what this verse is trying to describe. He gave them life and had a very intimate relationship with them. That is why they were hiding in shame, because they knew it would exacerbate the shame.
Yeah, it's it's the feeling of I'm not angry, I'm disappointed.
Yes.
Exactly. How people will say instinctually, well, the disappointment's worse than the anger. And I know this is a long episode, but I just really briefly want to put in here a connection to the Cain and Abel story, because I think it's interesting that if you, we'll get to it when we get to it, but if you look at the Cain and Abel story, what ultimately Abel seems to act in relation to Cain is that he's a bit of a judge for Cain. Or he's a bit of that, more so that contrast of this this is goodness. This is what you could be. And Cain is looking at Abel and saying, I'm not able to be that. I think it's interesting that humanity here, when confronted by that with God, it's fear. So they hide. When confronted by that with another human, it's anger.
Right.
It's expressed as anger.
Right.
Because there is the potential of seizing control over another human and murdering them. Resentment is powerful. You are powerful enough to overcome another human. You can't overcome God, so you're afraid.
We'll get to the serpent here in a few minutes, a few episodes. We'll get to the serpent, but there's something about bringing them down to your level, right? Which is, we'll talk about in a few moments, but it's sort of what the serpent was doing. And that becomes clear when we get to God's curse upon the serpent. But yeah, it's something similar to that. So
yeah, that's interesting.
All right, and then the last thing to look at in this verse is the trees, right? And this is a pattern we'll see repeated over and over, and it continues to this day. Is hiding amongst the trees, if you will. So in chapter 2, God makes the trees, right? For man to take pleasure in, both to look at and eat from. That's what it says, right? That's why the trees exist. In the previous verse, and we talked about trees sort of representing this idea of being grounded in the earth, but reaching towards the heavens, right? That's what trees do. They are rooted in the earthly and reach towards the heavens. In the previous verse, they take the leaves, right, and repurpose them as a covering for themselves to hide in shame. And now they're using the whole trees, right? They were using the leaves to hide the shame from themselves. Now they're using the whole trees to hide themselves from God. And I think this is something that we all do, right? We take parts of God's creation, often those things which, like trees, should be used to reach towards the heavens, and we use them to hide ourselves. So for instance, one example of this would be, and this is, it's a little esoteric, but you have to sort of think it through, is the idea of community, right? Community amongst humans, it should be used as something like the church, right? As a means of working together to reach toward the heavens in group worship and prayer and communal action and all of that. Oftentimes people use community to try and hide their sin, right? They look around and see what the majority of people do in a society, and that they do a thing or are okay with certain types of behaviors, and they use that as a way of covering their sin, right? Well, most people do this, so it's okay if I do it. Well, no, it's not, right? But that's what people do. They hide amongst amongst the community, hoping God won't see them. Of course, it's ridiculous. Obviously, God does. But that is one thing that I mean by sort of trying to hide among the trees, right? Here's community, something that should be used for good to reach towards the heavens, and instead we pervert it and hide among it, right? And we corrupt that thing as we do that, I guess. Which is why they couldn't stay in the garden, right? Because that would corrupt the trees. And so that is the issue. But we do those types of things, certainly. How many sinful, frankly, terrible people have been exposed that were leaders in church, right? I mean, how many leaders in church have been exposed of doing downright terrible things? And we could argue that they were trying to hide amongst the trees to keep their sin hidden.
Mm-hmm. I like this. I like the idea of, and maybe we'll get into a definition of sin as we go into another episode. But it feels that they're hiding their inadequacy. The sin revealed to them their inadequacy, and they're hiding they're
hiding both. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. They're hiding their shame, their shortcomings, their inability to be that, and so they attempt to. And the group, I think, is really the reason I say that is because I think it broadens out the way this story applies, I think. And so like the community example is, it's like it's not only are people potentially hiding their sin within the context of a community, but they're also hiding their inadequacy rather than standing, naked before God and saying, this is who I am.
Specifically the shame, right?
The shame connected. Yeah.
If you lived in our society, if footage went out of you beating baby penguins to death, just to go with something absurd, we would all look at you in a way where you should be ashamed, right?
Yeah.
But if you lived among a society that, I don't know, we all on our 18th birthday beat a baby penguin to death, then suddenly that wouldn't be a shameful thing anymore.
Yeah.
Although it should be. And it still maybe even is somewhat to those people, right? But they're trying to hide their shame in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's an interesting idea. That one has a lot of depth.
All right. Well, to wrap this up then, we should remember, again, we're approaching this not as the story of original sin, but of universal sin. In other words, this is not a story of a thing that happened one time and now as a result of that, all humanity suffers. Rather, it's a story about how every single one of us faces down sin in our lives, right? To that end, I think we should all be able to see that at one time or another, we found ourselves very much in the way men and women do here, right? Having sinned, recognizing our own unworthiness at the same time that God is reaching out to us. This is what's happening as God's voice is floating through the garden. He's reaching out to them, and we try to hide our sins and our shame, even from ourselves, right? And we hide from him. We try to hide who we are. We fail to fully realize that the light, remember, God is let there be light. God reveals himself through light in creation. What we fail to remember, and this is important, is that the light not only exposes things, it also can cleanse things. And so that a cleansing fire, we understand these ideas, right? And we forget that often. And certainly man and woman in this story weren't yet aware of this possibility. And maybe we aren't fully aware of that possibility, and that's why we hide. But yeah, in some ways, the state that man and woman find themselves here, it's worse than after they're expelled from the garden, if that makes sense. The state that they find themselves, right? Because at least once they're expelled from the garden, they have like some clarity of what they now face, and they have some understanding of what their relationship with God is. But there's I think, to me, there's nothing worse actually than hiding in a sense of shame where you there's so much unknown, right? Hiding in shame and unknown, and made all the worse because you're hiding from the one who is shameless, right? That's the low point, I guess. At least once you have faced the consequences and faced down God and now know the path forward, there's something there. But this moment that the man and woman find themselves in, I think you could argue right here that this verse is like the low point for humanity. So weirdly, it's actually one of my favorite verses for this reason, because when you show the low point, I think this verse concisely captures the absolute depth of how bad things can get for humans. It gets no worse, but from this point forward, hard truths are soon spoken by God, and things begin to sort of look upwards. And so I've come to appreciate this verse so much, because for me, it stands most plainly as the contrast. We've talked about contrast a lot this episode. It stands most clearly as the contrast of the hope we have in Christ. Mm-hmm. This right here, this verse, is like the peak hopelessness. That's what it is. It's the epitome of hopelessness, and Christ is the ultimate hope. So it's sort of by this moment. And this goes actually, frankly, to something that I think you and I talked about before this discussion of this story started. The idea that the story of man and woman here, it carries a sense of inevitability, right? I don't take it as like, oh, well, if they just had never sinned, they'd be in the garden forever, and that would be what it was. No, they were always going to sin. But understanding that God reveals himself to us through creation, in a way that sort of sin is necessary as a part of the process, as a part of the story, because this moment right here allows God to reveal how great he is in terms of being a hope for people, in terms of Christ being a hope. So in the idea that all creation exists to glorify God, the glory of his hope can't be understood without the contrast of utter hopelessness. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think we see in this verse. So for that reason, weirdly, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, not for what it is itself, but because of the role it plays in sort of the grand narrative of things. So, excellent. All right. With that, we'll wrap up. Like, subscribe, follow unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and share it with your friends. And from this point forward, it gets more hopeful. So look forward to what we got coming next. Awesome. All right, we'll see you then. Thanks.